The word Renaissance conjures up images of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo da Vinci sketching flying machines, and Florence bustling with wealthy patrons who saw themselves as midwives of rebirth. The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, is often described as a rinascimento, a rebirth of classical antiquity. It was the era when elite intellectuals and artists revived literally and conceptually the texts, aesthetic canons, and technical knowledge of classical antiquity, Pliny, Vitruvius, Euclid, Pythagorean harmonic theory, and fused them with new humanist methodologies. At least, that is the way the story is usually told. But the truth is more complex, and in many ways more fascinating. Because if we look beyond a tidy narrative of Europeans rediscovering their own ancient past, we find another major source of inspiration: the Islamic world. At precisely the time as the European Renaissance, the Islamic world, from Al-Andalus in Spain to the Ottoman Empire, from Cairo to Samarkand, was thriving. Historians often call this period the Islamic Golden Age, though its peak stretched from the 8th to the 13th centuries, with enduring influence well into the Renaissance. It was an age of dazzling intellectual activity, in which mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra, philosophers like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, wrote encyclopedias that dominated European medical faculties for centuries, and polymaths like Alhazen, Ibn al-Haytham, pioneered optics in ways that would later inspire Renaissance painters. Politically and economically, the Islamic world was dynamic, from the cultured courts of Nasrid, Granada, to the scientific centers of Abbasid Baghdad, from the cosmopolitan splendor of Fatimid Cairo to the powerful reach of the Ottomans, who by 1453 had taken Constantinople, placing Europe and Islam in direct contact. The Islamic lands often enjoyed greater urbanization and cross-Mediterranean trade networks than much of Europe until late medieval commercial revival. They supported institutional translation, scholarship, mathematics, optics, medicine, music theory, sophisticated crafts, textiles, ceramics, metalwork, monumental architecture, and complex court culture. These centers transmitted Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge transformed by Arabic scholarship into Latin Europe via translators, trade, and diplomatic contact. And yet, when we think of the Renaissance, Islamic contributions are often absent. Why? Part of the reason lies in Eurocentric history writing, where narratives of Christian rebirth overshadow the role of Muslim intermediaries. Another part lies in cultural prejudice, especially in the centuries after the Crusades, when acknowledging debts to Islam was politically inconvenient. But what is at stake in recovering this story is enormous. To recognize the exchange is to see the Renaissance not as a purely European rebirth, but as part of a global dialogue. It forces us to question narrow national histories and to appreciate creativity as a shared inheritance of humanity. By the end of this video, you will fully understand that the Renaissance was not simply a self-contained European miracle, but a dazzling tapestry woven from the threads of Islamic science, art, music, and architecture. You'll see how the domes of Florence whisper echoes of Ottoman mosques, how the arabesques of Granada crept into the margins of Christian manuscripts, how the lute in a Renaissance court once sang as the Arabic D, and how the very geometry that gave us perspective and proportion came to the hands of Muslim mathematicians. Most importantly, you will understand that creativity has always thrived at the crossroads of cultures, and that the Renaissance, far from being an isolated rebirth, was a truly global flowering of human imagination. To fully understand the cultural entanglements, we must picture the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a vibrant highway. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, ships, caravans, and pilgrims carried more than spices and silks. They carried ideas, aesthetics, and knowledge. Ordinary people felt this exchange in their clothing, in the ceramics on their tables, in the music they danced to, and even in the very architecture of their towns. The routes were many. Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled region of Spain until 1492, was a crucible of cultural blending, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims shared space and aesthetics. Sicily, too, had been under Muslim control, and its Norman kings in the 12th century famously decorated their palaces with Islamic craftsmen. The Crusades, though wars of conquest, paradoxically exposed Europeans to the sophistication of Islamic art and science. The great trading republics of Venice and Genoa ferried goods from Mamluk Egypt and the Ottoman Empire directly into European markets. Beyond that, the Silk Road funneled textiles and patterns that carried the imprint of Islamic geometry from as far as Persia and Central Asia into the workshops of Florence. But one of the most transformative conduits was the translation movement. In cities like Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Sicily, scholars translated Arabic texts, often themselves translations of Greek antiquity, but enriched with Islamic commentary, into Latin, Palermo, an Arab-Norman court, functioned as a lateral node where Greek, Latin, and Arabic cultures met visually and architecturally. These centers transmitted theoretical frameworks, algorithms, optics, musical theory, that later underpinned Renaissance technical advances. Philosophical, scientific, and artistic treatises moved across linguistic borders. Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, centuries earlier, had gathered texts from India, Greece, and Persia, preserving and expanding them. By the time Europe was ready for a rebirth, the knowledge was waiting, polished by centuries of Islamic scholarship, and trade made the ideas tangible. Venetian merchants did not just sell pepper and silk. They brought home damask textiles, Islamic ceramics, mamluk glass, and carved woodwork. These goods decorated European homes, churches, and palaces, seeding new ideas of luxury and beauty. Venetian and Genoese merchants maintained commercial treaties and established consular networks across the eastern Mediterranean and Mamluk ports. So what exactly was Islamic art? Unlike European art of the time, which often emphasized figural representation, Islamic art was governed by distinct aesthetic and theological principles. One of its most striking features was the use of geometric patterns, endless tessellations that reflected the infinite order of creation. Arabesques, intricate vine and floral motifs seemed to weave endlessly, symbolizing the unboundedness of God. Calligraphy was elevated to the highest of arts because the Quran was revealed in Arabic, making script not just a tool, but a sacred visual form. In mosques, where images of living beings were avoided to prevent idolatry, walls and domes bloomed with calligraphy and geometry. These abstract forms were not simply decorative. Islamic ornament often manifests explicit mathematical, cosmological, and philosophical thought. Proportional systems, Pythagorean harmonic ratios, adopted and adapted, and advanced trigonometry for star polygons and tilings. The repeated, non-ending arabesque corresponds to metaphors of the infinite, Taud, while geometric order reflects a cosmos intelligible through mathematics. The scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi wrote on proportion and harmony, while cosmological diagrams often mirrored the same symmetry we see in mosque decoration. The Islamic reluctance to portray human figures in sacred art, far from a limitation, produced an explosion of abstraction and ornamentation that dazzled European eyes, accustomed to saints and biblical scenes. For Europeans, the Islamic aesthetic was exotic, sophisticated, and eminently adaptable. When Islamic motifs arrived in Europe, they did not arrive quietly. They transformed whole industries. European manuscript illuminators began adding arabesque borders, filling their margins with foliage and pattern directly inspired by Quranic decoration. The geometric tiling systems of the Alhambra found echoes in the tile floors of Italian palaces. Luxury objects made an even bigger splash. Ottoman silks, with their tulip and carnation designs, became coveted across courts. Islamic carpets, so prized that they appear in countless Renaissance paintings, like those of Hans Holbein, became status symbols. Italian potters in places like Diuta tried to imitate Islamic lusterware with shimmering metallic glazes. Even household decoration, from the arrangement of courtyards to the carving of furniture, showed traces of the East. Bookmaking was another crucial channel. Islamic book art's codified frontispiece design, shamsa motifs, and dense marginal ornament that Europeans encountered both through Iberian manuscripts and imported volumes. The Islamic tradition of illuminated manuscripts, with its delicate balance of text and ornament, influenced the Renaissance graphic imagination. Calligraphy, admired for its elegance, inspired European scribes to experiment with more ornamental hands. The very idea of the book as a precious object owed much to Islamic models. Architecture was perhaps the most visible site of exchange. Europeans who had seen the Great Mosque of Cordoba or the Alhambra of Granada returned with ideas of arches, domes, and courtyards that redefined their own building traditions. The Venetian Gothic style is a case in point. Palaces along the Grand Canal, such as the Palazzo Ducale, feature pointed arches, ornate tracery, and facade patterns directly reminiscent of Mamluk Cairo. The historian Deborah Howard has shown how Venetian merchants, constantly traded with the Levant, imported not just goods but architectural ideas. In Spain, the mudéjar style, a hybrid of Islamic and Christian elements, endured long after the Reconquista. Churches, town halls, and palaces in Toledo or Seville were built with intricate wood ceilings, patterned brickwork, and ceramic tiles indistinguishable from Islamic prototypes. Even when political Islam had been expelled, its aesthetic lingered. Important examples are the Alcazar of Seville and Casa de Pilatos, where Nasrid or earlier Islamic forms are visibly continued and adapted into Christian palaces. A direct, persistent material lineage rather than mere imitation. Italian architects like Filippo Brunelleschi, while often looking to Rome, were also indirectly inspired by the domes and proportions of Islamic predecessors. Domes with double shells, common in Ottoman mosques, would find echoes in Renaissance cathedrals. But the influence was not merely decorative. Renaissance art prided itself on perspective, proportion, and harmony, concepts deeply indebted to Islamic science. The Arab mathematician Al-Khwarizmi's algebra and the geometric explorations of scholars like Omar Khayyam underpinned Renaissance mathematics. Most crucially, Ibn al-Haytham al-Hazan, in his book of optics, Kitab al-Manr from 1021, revolutionized the understanding of vision. Translated into Latin in the 12th century, his work argued that sight occurs when light enters the eye, not when the eye emits rays, and he experimented with lenses, mirrors, and camera obscura. Renaissance figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Alberti drew directly on these insights to develop linear perspective. Scholars trace lines of influence from Arabic optics to Roger Bacon and later European theorists. The marriage of art and mathematics in Islam, seen in the symmetrical tiling of mosques or in cosmological diagrams, gave Renaissance thinkers a template for their own ideals of harmony. Islamic aesthetic systems explicitly linked numerical ratios, harmonic intervals, Pythagorean heredity, and geometric composition. Treatises on proportion in music, by Al-Farabi, systematized the relations between audible and visible order. Renaissance humanists and artists absorbed these formalist impulses and combined them with revived classical aesthetics to formulate ideals of symmetria and mathematical proportion in painting and architecture. The cross-fertilization was mediated by translations and by object practice. Piero della Francesca, painter and mathematician, built on this legacy to craft mathematically precise compositions that epitomize Renaissance balance. When we think of art, we often forget music, but here too the Islamic world left an indelible mark. Scholars such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna wrote detailed treatises on music, describing scales, intervals, and rhythms with scientific rigor unmatched in Europe at the time. Al-Farabi's Kitab al-Musica al-Kabir 9-10c, and Avicenna's shorter treatises, translated into Latin, shaped medieval and Renaissance music theory. Their work was translated, transmitted, and read directly or via Jewish and Latin intermediaries by medieval European intellectuals. Concepts of makam, modal systems structuring Arabic music, resonated with European modes and inspired new ways of thinking about melody and harmony. Perhaps the most tangible influence was through instruments. The Arabic entered Europe via Al-Andalus, evolving into the lute, the quintessential Renaissance instrument. From the lute came later descendants such as the guitar. The rebab, a bowed string instrument, laid the groundwork for the violin family. Even percussion and wind instruments carried traces of Islamic predecessors. The impact was not merely technical. Contact with Arabic Andalusian and Ottoman court music gave European composers new sonic palettes. In Iberia, the Al-Andalusian musical legacy, like Nuba suites, modal practice, ornamentation, was absorbed into courtly practice and folk repertoires. Alfonso X of Castile's Cantigas de Santa Maria provide iconographic and documentary evidence of Moorish musicians in Christian courts, showing shared ensembles and instruments. Modal inflections, melismatic ornament, and rhythmic cycles from Andalusi practice contributed to the sonic substratum of Iberian folk styles. By the 16th century, Spanish Renaissance music carried the imprint of these encounters, with complex rhythms and ornamentation that owed as much to Granada as to Rome. In Italy, exposure to Ottoman ceremonial music, the powerful Mater bands, inspired both fascination and imitation. The contact with Eastern modes and exotic instruments entered courtly ceremonial and cultivated taste, broadening timbral palettes and repertory textures. However, the precise channels from single-voice Arabic modal practice into European polyphony are complex and debated. Some influence is clear at the level of repertoire contact, instrumentation, and modal vocabulary, though the formal techniques of Western polyphony developed in their own lineages while incorporating borrowed materials. Recent computational ethnomusicology finds melodic and ornamental affinities between Arab Andalusian and Spanish traditions. Thus, just as Islamic geometry shaped visual balance, Islamic music theory expanded European soundscapes. Of course, the story was not one of simple borrowing. Islamic motifs often underwent Christianization or rebranding. Geometric patterns used in mosques might reappear in church ceilings, stripped of their original meaning but admired for their beauty. The star-shaped vaults of Spanish cathedrals carried echoes of Islamic makarnas, but were presented as marvels of Christian engineering. Europeans adapted motifs into their own symbolic systems. The arabesque, once tied to Islamic notions of infinity, became a fashionable ornament in Christian manuscripts. Sometimes Islamic inscriptions were misread or transformed into pseudo-script that visually enhanced Christian imagery, halos, vestments. These adaptations often erased original calligraphy's textual meaning while preserving ornamental effect. Lusterware ceramics, originally inscribed with Arabic calligraphy, were reproduced in Italian workshops with Latin inscriptions or Christian imagery. Over time, many of these contributions were erased from the historical narrative. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as Orientalism and colonial ideologies took shape, historians emphasized the Renaissance as a purely European triumph, downplaying or ignoring Islamic roots. The carpets in Holbein's paintings became Oriental rugs without acknowledgement of their Islamic artistry. The lute was remembered as a European instrument without reference to its Arabic ancestor. So was the Renaissance truly European? Increasingly, historians argue it was not. It was part of a wider Afro-Eurasian network, a conversation stretching from Samarkand to Seville, from Cairo to Venice. The Renaissance, in this light, looks less like a self-contained rebirth and more like a moment when Europe reconnected to a global circuit of ideas, to networks of exchange. This tells us something fundamental about cultural exchange. Creativity thrives not in isolation, but in contact. The Renaissance flowered because Europe was open, sometimes willingly, sometimes through conflict, to Islamic knowledge and aesthetics. Recognizing this does not diminish Europe's achievements. It situates them in their true context as part of a shared human story. And in doing so, it challenges us to rethink our present. Cultural boundaries are porous, and innovation often comes from borrowing, adapting, and blending. Why does all this matter today? Because history shapes identity. If we see the Renaissance only as a European affair, we perpetuate myths of cultural isolation and superiority. If we acknowledge the Islamic contributions, we gain a richer, truer, and more interconnected picture of the past. It also teaches us about the dangers of cultural silos. Europe flourished not by closing itself off, but by opening to outside influence. The same lesson applies now in an age of globalization. Creativity blossoms when we are willing to listen, borrow, and adapt. Finally, recognition of this shared heritage can inspire a new kind of global creativity. Just as Renaissance artists fused Islamic geometry with Christian iconography or blended Arabic scales with European modes, so too can today's creators weave global traditions into something fresh. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth of antiquity, it was a rebirth through encounter. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all.